Hi, I'm Rob Godfrey in the Education Department from the Administrative Office of the Courts in Salt Lake City, Utah. We're talking today with Kathy Story, who is in Memphis, Tennessee. Kathy, what drew you from being a litigating attorney to creating a coaching, teaching, mentoring, consulting business for judicial education?
Well, after practicing law for a while, I realized that litigation was not a good fit for me. And I had started my career out in student affairs in higher education. I had the opportunity to go back to the academy, but this time as the legal presence in student affairs, and enjoyed that work, started doing some leadership work with the students there, and then met Pat Merle. And she was teaching graduate assistants Kolb's model. I was teaching them about academic dishonesty and classroom misconduct. But when I saw Pat, I thought, oh my gosh, this is fascinating. And then a position came open on her team to work with a federal grant for the Leadership Institute in Judicial Education. And I had the chance to work with her on that for 7 years, kind of traveling all over the country, meeting a lot of wonderful judicial educators and judges. And in the process, as the grant winded down, decided I really wanted to continue that work. And so I've had the privilege of working with some of your colleagues for 15 years. So that has really been rewarding. Then I decided also, in addition to the consulting with the courts, to add on this coaching component. And I mainly coach attorneys here in Memphis, but I work with other professionals also.
Wonderful, thank you. Second question, who has been a significant influence on your teaching philosophy in adult education?
Well, I think that started out with actually a graduate assistant I had in my undergraduate program, who many years later I married. I thought he was such a great teacher. He really included people, and you felt so welcome in his classroom and felt like everyone had something to contribute. Then in my graduate program in educational psychology and counseling, my major professor, Bob Brown, was an amazing guy in terms of writing about adult development, writing about developmental programming and adult education, and so he influenced me. And then when I started working with Pat, she introduced me to Parker Palmer, who I think is just a master teacher, to Kolb's experiential learning model, and also to the work of Bob Keegan. And if you've ever been in the room with Bob Keegan, he's a fantastic teacher. So my ideas about facilitation and teaching really come from all of that. And so I have Pat to thank for a lot of that influence.
Wow, that's amazing. Can you tell us what are some significant problems that you see in judicial education around the country?
Well, I think some real challenges right now have to do with issues like judicial wellness. There's just been a recent report that has come out from the ABA and Hazelton on the extent to substance abuse and anxiety and depression among lawyers. And of course, that's primarily who are on the bench. And that's really disturbing. And one thing that's disturbing is that it's both older attorneys, but also younger attorneys and people who have not practiced law for very long. And so that concerns you kind of about the pipeline for judges. And recently here in Memphis, we had a judge commit suicide. He had had a substance abuse problem, but it was just such a wake-up call. So those issues of resilience and how do you deal with compassion fatigue and vicarious trauma and the incredible public scrutiny that judges are under now and the expectations that people come to the courts with. So that whole area of judicial wellness and how you enhance judges' well-being is so important. Another issue I think is really diversity in the courts. And we're not just talking about generational differences, which of course is a huge factor of diversity now, but different ethnicities and cultures and languages and religions. And how do you help people feel included in all of that? How do you help them feel like they've really been heard in court? How do you deal with implicit bias? How do you deal with judicial attitudes and values and beliefs? And how do you really work with people in terms of demeanor and kind of the presence on the judge and in chambers? And that you don't achieve through just knowledge. There has to be some component of that that's very emotional. And I think, again, Kolb's model of experiential learning talking about the concrete experience and the reflective observation are so important, because that's where we can affect people's perceptions and values and beliefs and attitudes. And so I think that's very much a function of judicial education. I think that the other thing is this judicial idea of all this turnover now. Our baby boomers, the oldest, are reaching the age of 70 now, and in some states that's mandatory retirement age for judges. Certainly we know that right now in the workforce there are as many or more millennials than either Gen Xers or baby boomers, and of course that affects who's on the jury and who the attorneys are and who our court staff are, and soon that will affect who's on the bench. And so to understand how the generations differ in terms of the most effective learning for them, what their expectations are, what their perceptions. Because I think particularly even more so with millennials, that we need to be thinking about this identity, professional formation for them, because their experience of civic engagement has been very different than, say, the baby boomers. So that's a big area. And of course, always technology. So much more technology in the courtroom that leads to greater public access and scrutiny. That puts certain pressures. Court security, that whole issue had not been very great except for in the last decade or so. And I think also there's a lot more accountability of the courts. And so how do we deal with all of those pressures? One thing that's, I think, interesting also is thinking about the whole judicial family. And here in Tennessee, we do have a judicial kind of family institute that happens at the same time as our judicial conference. And some of these issues are addressed in that context too. Certainly the public scrutiny, certainly the issue of wellness. And so I think that's an aspect also that judicial education may consider if they're not already doing that in their state.
Wow, that's a lot to consider. Can you share some examples of some bright spots regarding judicial education that you've come across?
Well, I think judicial education across the country has become so much more professional. I mean, there's so many people out there with great experience and great educational backgrounds, and they bring so much to it. And I just expect that to continue as we go on. I think also there's several states that are really concerned about leadership and about developing leadership capacity among their judges, that they really are such an important part of our society, that the rule of law is so important, that they're important members of the community, and that thinking about leadership skill development, thinking about leadership philosophy development for judges. And in that regard, I've had the privilege of working, say, with North Dakota for many years. And they have, I think, a very well-developed program in that. And the same with Utah, in your state. The justice court judges and the district and juvenile court judges. And so there's many other states that are doing that kind of leadership development, which I think is important. In addition to that, I think that the states that are really attending to all three kinds of things, knowledge and skill development and that professional formation, so to go at that, go at all of those topics. And of course, with knowledge, we can deliver that in a traditional way, but when we're thinking about skill development, we've got to go over to the part of Kolb's circle that has to do with application, and we need to have people hands-on doing things, rehearsing, getting feedback, rehearsing again, getting more feedback. And then also, if we talk about professional formation, identity, ethics, judicial demeanor, all of those things really have to involve those emotional components, as I mentioned before, of the concrete and reflective observation. And I do think people are paying attention to that and really thinking about how do we do that, particularly now that we have technology and we can work with, blended learning, what's best done online, what's delivered most effectively online, and what's delivered most effectively in face-to-face interactions. And so I think those things are important. And a lot of different states, I know for sure Iowa and Utah and other places, are really attending to experiential learning opportunities. For instance, recently in Utah, the Justice Court judges went out and toured a museum that has to do with the Japanese internment camp that was in their state. And they studied the state court opinions at the time and really asked themselves the questions, how did this happen? Given our sense of justice, how did this happen in our country? And what can we do to prevent this from happening in the future? And those kind of programs where you hear real life experiences and see things, and then step back from it and reflect upon it and study the law about it. Combining all of those things, I think, are really bright spots.
Wonderful. Finally, in an ideal world, where would you like to see judicial education grow the most in the next 20 years?
Well, I think there's kind of three areas. One is that big aspect of social and emotional intelligence, and that would include, implicit bias and the judicial demeanor, and understanding how we develop emotional intelligence and how that affects all of our interactions, and how we can be effective leaders and effective judges and other court professionals through that. And in that, really looking at positive psychology, neuroscience, sports psychology, leadership studies, kind of bringing that all together and thinking about what does this have to say about the kind of programming we could be providing for judges. Another area that I think is important has to do with really highly interactive online learning. How do we do that? And I know that there are some programs out there where in continuing judicial education, some groups have the resources to design what we might almost think of as video games, where you choose an avatar, and that depending on what your avatar does in the courtroom, there's reactions, and then you have to make more decisions. And given that our millennials, or Gen Y, that group has really grown up with video games, could this be a very effective way to teach them? And especially if we can have that interactive components, if we can have that kind of direct and concrete experience components to that. Of course, that can be very expensive. And again, we have to ask ourselves what's best delivered online and what's best delivered face-to-face. But I think that thinking about the inverted classroom where people do all the reading and kind of all the homework outside of the classroom and only come to the classroom to interact with their peers, to do things together, work on projects together, to give each other feedback. That's a model that we could be thinking about in that way. And then the last one, I think, is about different models of law. That practice of law is changing and the practice of judging is changing. And are we sure that our judges know about restorative justice and therapeutic jurisprudence, about collaborative practice, about all of those kind of integrative ways of thinking about law, and not just in our problem-solving courts. It's wonderful that we have drug court and domestic violence court and veterans court and homeless courts, and all these different initiatives are so important, but we shouldn't limit this kind of training just to the judges who are serving in those courts, that it should be expanded, that we have more of a holistic view of courts. And I think society is turning to courts to solve more and more problems, and that this bigger view of really therapeutic jurisprudence and thinking about more than just the legal issues. And the good judges already do that. They do that instinctively. They understand that. But how can we deliver that in a more organized and very conscious and very thoughtful way? And I think that those are big challenges in judicial education. I think people are making headway on those already, and there's some great best practices out there. But again, you have to decide what's best, what are the needs of your state, and how can those best practices be modified to really make sure that the judicial education you're delivering to the judges, to the other staff in the courts is enhancing what we want, right? We want this sense of public trust and confidence in the court. We want support for an independent and unbiased, and a fair judiciary that are applying the laws and the processes as best they can. So I think those are big challenges, but I think that they're also exciting.
Wonderful. Kathy, thank you so much for sharing your time and your insights with us today.
Rob, you are so welcome. I have loved my association with all my colleagues in NASJA and being able to take advantage of their educational programming.